These are people who are seeking to establish their own righteousness. Paul says this is not in accordance with knowledge. They were zealous, but it wasn't according to knowledge. Paul says, "You've heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it." And then he goes on to say, "I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions." F.F. Bruce says there's an ambivalence about zealous, which is the Greek word for zeal. It may be good or bad, not only in respect of its object, but also in respect of the spirit in which it is cherished. Okay, so there's two things here. It could be bad or good, not only in respect of its object, that is the end for which the person characterized by the zeal is striving. What is the end? What's the goal? So it can be good or bad in respect of its object, but also in respect of the spirit in which it's cherished. So it could originate from fleshly, natural desires, or it could be motivated from true faith and love for God. So notice this. In Isaiah 9, we learn that God himself is characterized by zeal. Isaiah 9 says of Messiah, "There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore." The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So here we're told that this is going to happen because God is zealous for it. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So, quite obviously, zeal is not necessarily a bad thing. God himself is full of holy zeal to accomplish the increase, the spread of the reign of Christ. In fact, not only are we told that God is zealous, but listen to this in Exodus 34. It says, "Rather, you are to tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, and cut down their asherim. For you shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." The word for jealous here is actually the word for zeal. And so it could literally be translated, "You shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is zealous, is a zealous God." So here again, we're told that God is characterized by zeal. But notice it doesn't just say that he is zealous, it says that his name is jealous. So clearly, zeal is not in itself necessarily something bad. God himself is zealous. His very name is zealous or jealous. At the same time, we know that zeal can be rooted in the flesh. Paul refers to it in Galatians 5 as one of the deeds of the flesh. Galatians 5:19 says, "Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy." Notice the deed of the flesh, jealousy. The word is zealous, the word from which we get zeal. Notice it's flanked on either side by words like strife and outbursts of anger. Here, Paul is using it in its negative sense, in its bad connotation. The kind of zeal that characterized Paul before his conversion is what Paul has in view here. Prior to his conversion, Paul was characterized by zeal, to be sure, but it was a zeal directed at the wrong object. He was ignorant, he was wrong, and it was not born out of a regenerate heart. It was something that Paul was doing in his unconverted state. He was zealous, but zealously opposed to the gospel of Christ, to the people of Christ. He wanted to stamp out the church of God. This is why I said earlier, towards the beginning, zeal by itself is not necessarily an indication of the truth of something. Unbelievers can be characterized by zeal. In fact, Paul says that in this sense, it is a deed of the flesh. Notice what Jesus says in Matthew 23. He doesn't use the word zeal, but he's certainly describing zeal. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. So according to Jesus, people can be so zealous for error that they'll travel over land and sea, all the more precarious in the ancient world. They'll travel over land and sea just to convert somebody to what they're teaching, even though this will only make them twice as much a son of hell as themselves. So you could have a person who's characterized by zeal, who's nevertheless not zealous, or his zeal is not directed to the right end, and it is not born of God's Spirit. Now, here's the rub. Here's what I'm really driving at. Here is Paul again in Romans 10, and he's talking about zeal. Notice what Paul says. Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them, that is, for Israel, is for their salvation. Make no mistakes about it. Paul did not think that Israelites, qua Israelites, just because they were Israelites according to the flesh, that they were necessarily saved. It doesn't automatically follow. There's nothing about being an Israelite ethnically that automatically means that a person's going to be saved. Paul's desire and prayer to God for them is for their salvation. This is the purpose. His prayer to God, his desire for them is for this, for their salvation. He wants them to be saved. Does he desire the salvation of a people that aren't saved because they lack zeal? No. Paul says in verse 2, I testify about them that they have a zeal for God. These very Jews, these Israelites that Paul's praying for, whose salvation he desires, a salvation which they therefore lack. Paul testifies about them that they have great zeal for God. These people were zealous for God, just as Paul was. Maybe not as much. Maybe they didn't go to the extent that Paul did in trying to stamp out the church, though some did. Right? We even see Paul suffering at their hands. There were plenty of Jews that still wanted or were crying for the death of Christians, still opposing the gospel, still opposing Jesus. There were plenty still around, plenty like Paul. Paul says that they have a great zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. Their zeal was not according to knowledge. They were not actually zealous for the right thing, for the truth. But what was the ignorance? What was the ignorance that these men were laboring under? He says, for not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own. Paul, prior to his conversion to Christ, was trying to establish his own righteousness through law keeping. No doubt Paul would have said that it was the grace of God helping him to do that. But Paul and the Jews that were opposing Paul even after he became an apostle, and the Judaizers who pretended to be Christians, but were asserting that faith in Christ was not sufficient. These are people who are seeking to establish their own righteousness. Paul says this is not in accordance with knowledge. They were zealous, but it wasn't according to knowledge. They were ignorant of God's righteousness, and ignorance of God's righteousness is precisely this, seeking to establish their own. Paul says they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. What is it to subject oneself to the righteousness of God? Well, one thing we know that it's not, first of all, is seeking to establish one's own righteousness. Submitting to God's righteousness, his saving righteousness, is antithetical to trying to establish your own. So what is it to submit to God's righteousness? He goes on, verse 4, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Here, what Paul is saying is that the end of the law, that to which the law pointed, is Christ. Christ is the end of the law. The law is pointing people to faith in Jesus for righteousness. It's not pointing people to their own law keeping. It's not pointing people to their own law keeping by the grace of God. It's teaching people to trust in Christ, the only one who actually kept the law of God. This is what it means to submit to God's righteousness and not to attempt to establish one's own. Anything contrary to this might be zealous, but it isn't according to knowledge, and it doesn't save.